Picture a Roman soldier. You already know exactly what he looks like. The rectangular shield, the helmet with the red plume, and of course, the lorica segmentata, those iconic metal bands wrapping around his chest like armor plating. It is arguably the most recognizable military uniform in human history. When you think Roman legionary, you think of that steel shell protecting his torso. It looks like plate armor. In fact, many people assume it is plate armor. And here is where things get interesting. Those metal bands were incredible, but they were not a full suit of steel. They were not the kind of armor that a medieval knight would wear head to toe. Rome had the best engineers in the ancient world. They had the largest economy. They had master smiths working across 3 continents. So why did they stop at metal strips? Why didn't a centurion ever march into battle wearing a full, bulletproof suit of solid steel plate like a knight would 1,000 years later? The answer is not what you think. It is not that they couldn't figure it out. Romans were not idiots. They knew how to work metal. They built aqueducts and bridges that still stand today. The uncomfortable truth is this. They looked at the idea of the invincible armored warrior and decided it was a terrible idea. The reason why involves economics, marching distances, and eventually, a total collapse of their supply chain. Let's dig into why Rome said no to the knight in shining armor. First, we need to talk about what Roman armor actually was. The lorica segmentata was not a solid breastplate. It was not one piece of shaped steel protecting the chest. It was strips of iron held together by leather straps and brass hooks. Think of it like overlapping metal blinds. Each strip could move independently. This design was brilliant for one very specific reason. It was modular. If you took a sword hit and one strip cracked, you did not throw away the entire suit. You just unhooked that strip and replaced it. A blacksmith could swap out a damaged piece in minutes. Compare that to a solid breastplate. If a medieval breastplate got dented badly, you needed a specialist to hammer it back into shape on an anvil. If it cracked, the whole thing was useless. Rome was not interested in gear that required a master craftsman every time something broke. They needed stuff that a camp blacksmith could fix with basic tools. But here is the bigger reason the segmentata worked. Romans did not fight like medieval knights. A knight in full plate armor fought alone or in small groups. He was a one-man wrecking ball. He needed steel covering every inch of his body because he did not have a shield wall protecting him. A Roman legionary was the complete opposite. He fought shoulder to shoulder in a formation with dozens of other men. And he carried a scutum. If you have never seen one in person, go look it up. It is massive. It is a curved rectangular shield that covered a soldier from his chin to his shins. When Romans locked shields in formation, they created a moving wall of wood and iron. The scutum was their plate armor. It was their bulletproof vest. Wearing a heavy steel suit under a heavy wooden shield is redundant. It is like wearing 2 winter coats. You are not twice as warm. You are just exhausted. Now, let's talk about the logistics. Because this is where the plate armor idea falls apart completely. Rome had to equip somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 soldiers at any given time. That is not a small army. That is a nation under arms. Making a single custom-fitted suit of plate armor takes a master smith several weeks. You have to measure the person. You have to forge each piece individually. You have to fit it to their exact body shape, because if it does not fit perfectly, they cannot move. A breastplate that is too tight restricts breathing. One that is too loose shifts around and leaves gaps. There is no such thing as one-size-fits-all plate armor. Meanwhile, chainmail and the segmentata could be mass-produced. Roman armories were basically factories. Workers could punch out iron strips or weave mail links by the thousands. A segmentata did not need to fit like a glove. You could adjust the leather straps to fit anyone from a skinny teenager to a barrel-chested veteran. Rome chose quantity over quality because they needed an army, not a collection of custom-wrapped knights. Then there is the metallurgy problem. This is the part that people miss. Rome had iron. They did not have high-quality hardened steel. There is a massive difference. To make a large breastplate that does not crack when you get hit with a warhammer, you need blast furnaces. You need advanced tempering techniques. You need to be able to control carbon content in the metal. None of that existed in the Roman Empire. Their iron was relatively soft. If they made a large solid plate and someone hit it hard, it would just bend inward. Imagine getting punched in the chest while wearing a cookie sheet. The metal does not stop the force. It just transfers it into your ribs. Small overlapping strips actually absorb shock better. When one strip gets hit, it can flex independently, without warping the entire structure. The design was not just clever, it was working around the limits of their materials. And here is something most people forget. Roman soldiers were not just fighters, they were endurance athletes. The nickname for a legionary was Marius's mules. They marched 20 miles a day, carrying 60 pounds of gear. Then they built a fortified camp. Then they fought. Roman power was not about having the toughest individual soldier. It was about being able to move an entire army faster than anyone else and still have energy left to fight. Full plate armor is a heat trap. It does not breathe. In the Mediterranean summer, wearing a full steel suit is like being locked in a car with the windows up. Soldiers would pass out from heat stroke before they ever saw combat. The segmentata had gaps. Air could flow through. Sweat could evaporate. A Roman soldier could march all day in that armor and still be able to lift his sword when the enemy showed up. Plate armor turns you into a slow-moving oven. Rome needed fast-moving soldiers. Now here is the twist that nobody talks about. The Lorica segmentata actually disappeared before the Roman Empire fell. You would think that as Rome got richer and more advanced, they would upgrade their armor. The opposite happened. By the 3rd century, the segmentata was gone. Soldiers went back to wearing chainmail. The older, simpler Lorica hamada. Why? Because the economy collapsed. The 3rd century crisis was a nightmare. Civil wars, inflation, supply chain breakdowns. Suddenly, Rome could not afford to maintain the segmentata. Those little iron strips needed constant repairs. The leather straps rotted. The brass hooks corroded. It required a functioning logistics network to keep replacing parts. Chainmail, on the other hand, was nearly indestructible. A good shirt of mail could last for decades. If a few rings broke, you just wove in new ones. It did not need a factory. It did not need replacement parts shipped from across the empire. When times got tough, Rome did not upgrade to better armor. They downgraded to simpler armor because simpler armor was all they could afford to keep in the field. This is the part where the whole question flips on its head. We have been asking why Rome did not use plate armor. But plate armor was never the goal. Rome was not trying to create an invincible soldier. They were trying to win wars. And wars are not won by having the best equipped individual fighter. They are won by having the most soldiers who are good enough to do the job. 100 men in decent armor will always beat 10 men in perfect armor. Rome understood this. They were not fighting duels. They were fighting wars of attrition. They needed gear that could be made quickly, repaired easily, and worn by anyone. The segmentata was the sweet spot. It was better protection than cloth or leather, cheaper than mail, and faster to produce than anything custom-made. When that became too expensive, they went back to mail. And when mail became too expensive, they started using cheaper and cheaper versions until soldiers were basically wearing reinforced jackets. The medieval knight in full plate armor is an icon. It represents the peak of personal protection. But it also represents a completely different kind of warfare. Knights were aristocrats. There were never that many of them. A medieval army might have a few hundred knights supported by thousands of peasant infantry. The knights were the elite. They could afford to spend a fortune on custom armor because they were individually valuable. Rome did not have knights. Rome had legions. They had tens of thousands of identical soldiers who needed identical gear. The system was built for scale, not for perfection. So here is the resolution. Rome did not use plate armor because it would have been a logistical disaster. They could not make enough of it. They could not maintain it. They could not march in it. And most importantly, they did not need it. The shield wall was their armor. The segmentata was just there to protect against the hits that got through. When you understand that Roman military doctrine was about endurance and discipline rather than individual invincibility, the armor makes perfect sense. It was exactly as good as it needed to be, and no better. Technology does not always move forward. Sometimes the best gear is not the most advanced gear. Sometimes the best gear is the gear you can actually afford to give to your entire army. Rome made that choice. They picked the practical option over the impressive option. And for 500 years, it worked. If you want to see more history that focuses on the practical side instead of the myths, hit that subscribe button, because there are a lot more stories like this where the real answer is way more interesting than the legend.